Hi, seventh grade. So this is an example of an A project for the summative we're working on right now called Unit 1, Identity in the Middle Ages Summative. So we just finished the 3 books, Castle Diary, The Canterbury Tales, and The Midwife's Apprentice. So now we're going to take some time to pick a passage from one of those 3 books, and then we're going to break it down into its narrative elements and narrative techniques. Okay? So here's my passage. I got it from the Canterbury Tales, and the specific tale I got it from was the Pardoner's Tale. Okay. If you remember, that tale is about how Dip, Grab, and Cut are trying to kill Death. And I included the page numbers here. So here's my passage. "Who knows where Death carries men off to?" said a deeply hooded character sitting in the corner of the bar. "But he sure enough comes for every man in the end. And he's taken twice his share recently, thanks to the plague." Tears of indignation started into Grab's eyes. "I don't see what gives Death the right to go carrying off anyone," he slurred. "And if you ask me, it's about time some brave soul stood up to Death and put an end to his carryings on. His carryings off, I mean. Dip, Cut, where are you?" And he stumbled off into the sunlight to look for his 2 closest friends. Dip was at home in bed, but not for long. Grab knocked him up and called him into the street. They met with Cut, coming home from a card game and cursing his empty pockets. Grab threw an arm over each friend's shoulder. "Have you heard old Collie the Fence is dead? Death carried him off, him and all his family, in a couple of days. Let's take an oath, friends, not to rest until we've tacked down this Death fellow and stuck a knife between his ribs. Think what the mayor and parish would pay if we brought in Death's dead body. Besides, how many purses do you think he's emptied on the dark highway, eh? Death must have made himself quite a walletful by now." That's the end of my passage. And notice I read the passage fluently, no stumbling. If you do find yourself stumbling, please reread your passage until you can read it all the way through clearly. Now it's time for the 2 say something techniques. So you only have to do 2 to get the basic points for achieved. But notice I did 4 here so I could get some extra points. Okay, so as I read the beginning of this passage, I thought, that's why I highlighted it here, "Who knows where Death carries men off to?" said a deeply hooded character sitting in the corner of the bar. My prediction is, I predict that the shadowy character at the bar is Death. He isn't given a name, but his description is very similar to what I know Death will look like later in the story. Sorry, my R key isn't working very well. Okay. My comment is he slurred. So I'm going to go up here and find that. So he says, tears of indignation started into Grab's eyes. "I don't see what gives Death the right to go carrying off anyone," he slurred. So my comment is, he slurred. I know people slur their speech when they've had too much alcohol to drink. He must be drinking a lot. If he's drinking a lot, then he's not thinking clearly. No human can kill Death. I'm going to add, but he wants to kill Death. Again, people aren't thinking clearly when they're drunk, so he's clearly not thinking clearly since it says he slurred. That's why I made that comment there. Okay? My next comment. I noticed that each time Death is mentioned, that it is capitalized. You only capitalize the first letter of a name if it's a person. The pardoner, R. The pardoner must be trying to personify Death, give Death human characteristics. If you notice, Death, 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 Death is capitalized here, Death is capitalized, Death, and Death is capitalized there. My last point of say something here, I'm going to use a question, is that's a bit ironic. How can you kill someone that is already dead in reference to Death? Okay. Now going through, you must identify the protagonist. The protagonist character, and explain what level of medieval society that they are in and how that affects them with an example from your passage. Okay, so here's what I have. The protagonist of the storyteller is the pardoner. Pardoners were not priests or bishops, but they had some of the responsibilities of priests and bishops, mainly offering pardons for sins. They often manipulated and persuaded people by fear to pay for forgiveness of their sins. I'm going to add, they were part of the noble class. So they were high up in society. Okay? So this theme, or this main message of the entire story of the Pardoner's Tale, is that death comes for us all in the end. So it is very important for you to have your sins forgiven by the pardoner. Okay. So what I did there was I identified what level of society he was and how that affects him. So other people are afraid of the pardoner because he's high up in society and he's talking about death all the time and he's talking about how your sins need to be forgiven and how if your sins aren't forgiven then you will go to hell. So again, I want a full picture of your protagonist in the story here. Okay? You must identify the central conflict and explain how this passage relates to the central conflict with at least one reason it relates to the central conflict. So within the story, the three protagonists, Dip, Grab, and Cut, are all looking to kill Death so they can get rich, right? They also want to kill Death so many people will not die. Okay. The passage I selected is the central problem of the story. The pardoner is telling. So in this situation, the passage I selected is the central problem. But if your passage is not the central problem, you need to explain how it relates to that. Okay? You must explain the type of pacing that is being used in your passage and why the author is using this pacing at this point of the story. Okay? So the pacing of this passage is slow. I know this because the plot is focused on the reality that death is killing so many people. The word death is used almost 10 times in 4 paragraphs. The author also spends much of this passage talking about how death should be stopped. The other half of the passage is about Grab getting his friends to go and find and kill Death. At this point, the pacing of the story is still slow. The author is spending a lot of time on the dialogue between the characters, the 3 characters. They are talking about the multiple reasons why killing Death would be good. The best reason being they would be rich. So again, there's 4 paragraphs here, and it's all focused on one thing. Pacing is slow when one event is being focused on. Pacing is fast when the author is taking you through multiple events in a little bit of time. So let's say the author takes you through 4 events in just 1 paragraph. That's fast pacing. So when an author does that, they want you to get to the next big event, right? But in this case, the pacing of my passage was slow. Okay? Now you must explain how at least one narrative element with an example is being used by the author in your passage. So here's mine. The passage I selected is placed at the beginning of the book, so the narrative element that is being used here is establishment or exposition. This is when an author is attempting to introduce characters, background information, and most importantly, the central conflict of a story. The author does that by introducing us to Old Harry, Grab, Dip, Cut, and Death. So we're introduced to these characters. That's how I know it's the establishment and exposition. We see that the problem is that so many people are dying because of the plague, and Death is the one who is really responsible for that. So that's what my exposition, that's what my narrative element did. It showed me the characters and it showed me the problem. Okay, I'll highlight that. So I'm introduced to the characters and the problem in my narrative element. Okay, now my narrative technique. Dialogue is a narrative technique used in the passage I selected. It is used to introduce the central conflict, that death is killing too many people at once and must be stopped. This happens when, so this is my example now, this happens when Grab is at the bar talking to old Harry about how old Collie the Fence died as well as his entire family. Okay, so I should add that, we, the readers, learn from the dialogue what the central conflict is. Okay? Now, my last narrative technique is foreshadowing. Who knows where death carries men off to, said a deeply hooded character sitting in the corner of the bar. While this character isn't named, they are described with adjectives like deep and hooded. This shadowy character only speaks up after hearing about all the killing going on. I know this is foreshadowing too because late in the story, the pardoner describes death in great detail, and it is exactly like this character. The presence of this character in the bar, the presence of this character in the bar is the author trying to hint at who the three men will meet. Okay, so again, foreshadowing hints at what's about to happen, and I know this is foreshadowing because later when death is described, he's described just like this. Okay, so let's look at my rubric. All right, see how I did. I chose a passage that was from one of the 3 novels we read, and it's at least a page long. Okay, so I got achieved. Reading fluency and comprehension strategies. Okay, I read fluently, read my passage fluently, and I didn't stumble over any words in my passage, and I used 2 or more say something strategies. Remember, I used 4. Okay, I chose a character. I explained how my character, where they were in medieval society. Remember, he was a pardoner, so he's part of the clergy, and clergy is at the top of the medieval hierarchy. I identified the central conflict, and I explained how my passage was related to that. I explained the pacing of my passage, and explained why the pacing was slow. I included one example of a narrative technique and told you guys why the author put that technique in there. I included one example of a narrative element and chose why the author is using that narrative element at that point in the story. And lastly, my presentation is recorded and uploaded on Flipgrid, and my voice was clear, and I used many different tones to show excitement as I was presenting. So my grade is a 30.5 out of 32, which gives me 95%, which is an A. Okay, if you want an A on this project, do everything that I just did, and you will get one. All right, you will earn yourself an A. Follow this rubric, look at the example, read the directions, and if you have any questions, let me know. All right, thank you guys, and good luck.